You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Rick McKenna, but today's case is the solved case of the Grim Reaper of Paris, or the monster of Montmartre. And this is a killer with many names, but for years no one knew the real one. A monster right under the noses of investigators who was kept secret simply because of the lack of technology at the time. The motives behind these murders are sure to enrage you, and the outcome is even more heartbreaking. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. I also want to say that next month there is a surprise for you guys. I may be posting a lot for October, but I didn't tell you, so you might want to come back because it's going to start the first of the month and there's going to be a lot of content up on this channel. So yeah, let's get back to the story. Also, this is another case from a different country and they speak French and I do not, so I did try my best to find the right pronunciation of these names and places, but if I mess up, I am so sorry. I'm not meaning to enrage you or disrespect anybody. I just simply don't speak French, so I'm not going to be the best at it, but I did try. So it was 1984 in France, and Germaine Petitot was a 91-year-old woman living in Paris. She would actually be assaulted inside her own home on October 5th. Now, when the police were called, she was actually still alive. She had survived, however, she was too traumatized to be able to relive this experience she had just gone through and tell the police who her attacker was and what exactly happened. However, they knew that she was just lucky to be alive, because the same day, another woman, an 83-year-old named Anna Barber-Ponthis, was found murdered in her own apartment as well. She was beaten and suffocated with a pillow, and she also had been robbed with the equivalent of $50. Now, police knew that a serial killer was on the loose, and this serial killer would rob, strangle, torture, and kill their victims. Yet no one was a witness to these crimes. No one saw an attacker, no one saw any of this happening because they were all inside of these victims' homes. Over the next 2 months, 7 more women would be murdered in this area, all elderly and all living in the 18th district. This was said to be a place called Butte Montmartre that sits on top of a hill, and it was known to be a place where people who had smaller incomes would live. It was cheaper living, and so a lot of elderly who had retired and who were living off of their retirement would live here. And the next victim was actually an 89-year-old named Suzanne Foucault, and they would not find her body in the same way that they found the first 2 women. On October 9th, 4 days after the first victims were found, her apartment building was set on fire. Now, inside, Suzanne had a plastic bag over her head and she had been suffocated. Now, around $550 was stolen from her, as well as her watch. With these victims being poor, helpless individuals, the public was pushing even harder to get this case solved and to get a suspect in custody. It was even more repulsive that someone could kill someone that was so vulnerable, like an elderly person, to just rob them of some money. It was said about the community, the sense of fear among the population persisted, compounded by the professional disarray and still having failed to question them and not having been able to do anything to ease the concern of the public. It was said to be mass hysteria in this area, and officers Claude Perroni and Jean-Claude Mules couldn't get used to being woken up in the middle of the night for these calls to go and find these elderly women murdered. They were constantly having this occur, and they were just traumatized, as the public was, that this continued to happen and they couldn't do anything to stop it. They dreaded the phone ringing, yet there was nothing they could do because they couldn't find the killer. And nearly a month later, it was November 5th, and the next call would come. Now, this was because a 71-year-old named Iona Cesario had been found tied up with electrical wire and beaten to death. She was a retired teacher, and she had around $11,000 stolen from her. And ultimately, that's why they believed she was killed. It would only be 2 days until another victim was found, and this time it was by a family member of the deceased. You see, the son of 84-year-old Alice Benaim would walk into her home and find his mother beaten to death. Around $440 was stolen, and during this autopsy of her body, it was found that she had taken cleaning fluid. She had been forced to drink this chemical that ultimately killed her. It appeared as though this killer was upping the torture and the frequency of the kills, and there was no sexual activity found on these victims either, but these women were still having their lives taken from them. And just the next day, a care nurse would actually walk into their patient's home to find them murdered. This was Marie Choi, who was tied up and gagged with a towel. She had been tortured, and her fingers had actually been twisted like she was being forced to give up some sort of information. This was thought to be where the money was, because $220 was taken from her. It appeared as though robbery was the motive, but if so, why was the torture becoming the most elaborate part of the kill? That's what investigators couldn't figure out. They believed that this killer was beginning to enjoy the kill more than the money that they were thought to have started killing for, and this, of course, was very dangerous. Just the next day, it was November 9th, and Mariah Mico Diaz was stabbed and suffocated with a cloth. She was 75 years old and robbed of $220. There was no pattern of where this killer would strike again, sometimes within the month, sometimes within the day, but this time it was 3 days until another victim was found, and this time there was 2. From what I could find, this was not a couple. This was just 2 different individuals who lived in the same apartment building but lived in 2 different apartments. This was Jean Laurent, who was 82, and Polly Victor, who was 77. Now, both had their apartments, and when investigators went inside after they found them a week later, they found that their apartments were completely messed up, as though somebody had gone through all of their belongings and found nothing, because nothing was actually stolen. The only thing officers believed they could do was catch the killer in the act, so they sent out hundreds of different officers to basically stake out this 18th district area where these murders were occurring to hopefully catch them as they suspiciously roamed about, had something on their belongings that showed what they used to kill these people or to tie them up, and ultimately, after this, the killing stopped, at least for a while. The killer, however, would soon find a new place to cause chaos. The only thing the officers had during this time was fingerprints that they acquired from the crime scenes. However, at this point, there was no criminal database that had these fingerprints inside of it. So, if somebody was brought into custody that had these fingerprints, they could not be matched to this person. This suspect would have to be in custody with them at that point in suspicion of being a killer for them to test the fingerprints on them. So the fingerprints were practically useless at this time. Investigators tried every form of investigation they could think of, but they began to believe the only way that they would solve this case was out of pure luck. And so far, it didn't seem like that was going to happen. Just when the officers believed that the killer had stopped, possibly been caught for another crime, possibly another murder, and locked up, or maybe even died, the murders began again. Instantly, they knew that this was the same killer who had been killing before, who was dubbed, the Grim Reaper of Paris, the old lady killer, the monster of Montmartre, and this killer was back. Now, at this point, they were also sending fingerprints to all of the different prisons in the area, thinking, okay, maybe they just got released from prison and that is why they are back and killing again. So they hoped that they could ask the prisons to match basically the people who had just been released and their fingerprints, but this came back with nothing. What they didn't know was that this wasn't successful because the killer hadn't been in prison. It was a year later from when all of those other murders had occurred, and on December 20th, 1985, a 91-year-old woman was found strangled in her home. This was the same MO, but this was not the 18th district like before. The killer had expanded to the 14th. Now, everyone was back on high alert all around Paris, and just 15 days later, this killer struck again. This time it was January 4th of 1986, and André Ledame was found murdered at 77 years old. Only 5 days after that, another victim was found, and this was 83-year-old Yvonne Coron, and the murders would just continue after that. There was already 11 victims, but that didn't mean that this killer was stopping anytime soon. 8 days passed, and then 2 women were found on the same exact day in completely different areas. This was Marjem Durumble and Françoise Vendôme, and on January 15th, which was 3 days later, Yvonne Chabal was found as well. These were rapidly piling up, and this killer was still not being caught. This was also quite far away from where the killer originally started at the 18th district, because this was now the 5th district. Now, the killer didn't seem to be staying in one place. It's not like they moved just to the 5th district. They were moving all over, going to different districts all the time. And the next victim was actually 76-year-old Virginie Lebret. And just like the first spree of murders, fingerprints were being found at these new crime scenes, and they could actually match them to the first spree of murders, which made them certain that this was the same killer. But it now appeared as though these murders were becoming less about torture and robbery. But if both of those were gone, what did that leave? Just the thrill of killing? Well, this didn't make the murders any less heartbreaking of these vulnerable, helpless, elderly women. I mean, some were parents, some were grandparents, some were just finally able to relax after working so hard their whole life, and they were finally in their retirement, and then they were murdered for just a little bit of cash. This is when yet again the killer went quiet. It was February, March, April, May, June, and officers received no calls that pertained to murders from this killer. Sadly, this was not the end. June 14th, Ludilla Lieberman was found attacked in her home and killed. Another 5 months went by with radio silence, but little did the officers know they actually had their killer in custody for another crime. Yet, as soon as this killer was released, they were back to killing once again. So, this was actually 16 months later, and on November 25th, 1987, 79-year-old Rachel Cohen was killed as well. Now, do you remember the first victim I told you about of this spree killer, who was named Germaine Petitot, the one who survived and was too traumatized to say anything? Well, she was the only woman to survive this killer at this point, and she still wasn't talking. She was still too traumatized, and it's completely understandable. But now, there would be another survivor. You see, 2 days later, an 87-year-old woman named Berthe Finaltry was strangled. Or so the killer thought. They had tried to strangle her, but she would be a survivor. You see, she would actually be screaming for help in her apartment building, and the concierge, the front desk lady, would hear her screaming and run to her rescue, and the attacker actually ran. Now, in the hospital where this woman was, the police questioned her about what this attacker looked like, and she actually could tell them. She said that this was a mixed-race man in his 20s with hair like Carl Lewis, and it was blonde, and he had an earring in his left ear. A sketch was made, and the search began. But while they looked, another woman would actually be murdered. This was 73-year-old Genevieve Germont, and she would be this killer's last victim. 4 days later, and they hadn't found anybody who matched this description. However, on December 1st, a local police inspector named Francis Jacob was just walking down the street when he saw a man that could possibly match. He immediately brought this man into custody. This is when Thierry Paulin was brought into custody. He was 23 years old and he had a criminal record. And some of these dates where he was in prison actually matched the dates when this killer wasn't murdering people. They believed that this meant that they had the right man in custody, and they began to question him. His fingerprints then came back as a match to the crime scene. Now they just needed a confession. And actually 2 days later, Thierry would confess to murder. Not just one, but 21 victims. Though police only knew about the 18 that I told you about, so nobody knew where these other 3 women had come from. He said that he approached women on the street, and if they were nice to him, he let them go. If they weren't, he followed them home and killed them. He was said to be extremely relaxed while saying all of this, and he had trouble figuring out which murder was which and, what he did to each victim. He was sent to jail at this point to await his trial, but Thierry had also informed police something they didn't know, that he hadn't acted alone. To get him to admit that he was not alone, that he had an accomplice, there was the drain fluid that was used on one of the victims. They forced her to drink this, and this was brought into the interrogation room, and it was showed to Thierry. And the officers asked Thierry what it was, and he said it wasn't his. It was Jean's, and he just kind of spit it out while they were talking, trying to make himself look better. And finally, they got him to say who this Jean was. Now, a forensic psychologist looked into Thierry and said he acted like anyone who visited him was a burden, like he didn't want to talk to anybody, and he was also said to not have any mental illness, but he participated in psychopathic activities. It was also theorized that he went after elderly women because of his grandmother and how she treated him, which we will get into in a moment. Now, during a conversation with his lawyer, and also Jean's lawyer, his accomplice, Jean and Thierry were both questioned together. Jean tried to say that Thierry was the one who killed them, and Thierry just manically laughed the entire time while Jean looked at his shoes and said nothing. You see, Thierry had been born November 28th, 1963 in Fort-de-France, and his mother was actually still a teenager at this time, and it was believed his father was as well, but his father actually left him as soon as he was born. Thierry ended up being raised by his father's mother, who was successful, owned her own restaurant, but was said to not give him very much attention. So when he was around 10, he decided to move back to his mother, who had since grown up a little bit, gotten married, had her own kids. And so when Thierry moved in, he didn't do very well with this new family, and by 12 it was said that he was threatening his step-siblings, he was harming them, and he also brought a knife to school at this point and threatened a teacher. The school staff was extremely concerned, rightfully so, and they wrote a note to his mother asking her, if she needed help, what they could do, just discussing his behavior. And this actually was intercepted by Thierry, who forged his mother's signature and sent it back to the school without her ever reading it. It was said that as a mixed-race student, he actually had a lot of problems with bullying. He struggled to make friends, and most of his class was white, and he didn't feel very accepted. Eventually, he failed his exams, he dropped out of school, and at this point, his mother asked his father to take custody of him. His father was said to do so mainly because of the child support he would be getting, but he was also going to be teaching Thierry a trade skill in order for him to get a job. When he arrived at his father's home in France, he was put into a college where he could study hairdressing as well as electrical trade, but again, he failed and ended up dropping out to become a door-to-door salesman. Now, this was during the day so he could party at night. That is what he was most passionate about and what he did all the time. But by the time he was 17 years old, he actually entered the military to be part of the parachutist regiment of the French army. His role was to be a hairdresser. And this is where it was said that the bullying began again for the fact that he was black and that he was gay. 2 years later, he was on leave from the army when he would rob a grocery store at knife point. This was somewhere he frequented, though. He went there to get his groceries, so the owner knew him and immediately called the police. But when he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison, this was actually suspended, and he didn't spend any time at all. It's said that maybe the owner felt bad and decided to drop the charges. 2 years later, when he was 21, he left the army completely, and Thierry went to live with his mother in Paris once again. Then he decided to get a room at a hostel because they were not getting along very well. He also at this point began to work in a nightclub to get some money, and he performed as a drag queen and sung Eartha Kitt songs there. This is where Thierry would meet a man named Jean-Thierry Materon, who was 19 years old, and they fell in love. The problem was Jean was a drug addict. However, Thierry was said to be addicted to drugs as well, just to a lesser degree, and he actually sold them so he could get Jean these drugs. So together they moved into a hotel room. They partied all the time, every night, but they were quickly running out of money to stay in the hotel, to have drugs and alcohol, and to party. So they were putting this all on credit cards, but then they decided to hatch a plan to pickpocket people of the city and to get some extra cash. Unfortunately, this would escalate to murder. They both began to single out elderly women who were the weakest of them all. They knocked on their doors, and Thierry would cover their mouths while Jean would close the door. And then it was said that they would torture these women, asking them where the money was, and Jean would go and look for the money while Thierry watched over them. It was said that Thierry was the one to often kill them. Sometimes, however, they would do it together. Jean was said by Thierry to be the more violent one, the more torturous one, the one who did the killing, but Jean said the same about Thierry. Some victims had broken noses, bruises, and burns, and they went through much more than just a robbery gone wrong. Jean and Thierry were using this money to buy more drugs, to be accepted into these wealthy crowds, and to party as hard as they wanted. No one ever suspected a thing about them either, because people knew Thierry as a very sensitive person, immensely kind and considerate. However, these two began to murder more frequently, and this caused hundreds of officers to canvass that 18th district. So, that's when they both decided to go and live with Thierry's father in Toulouse. This didn't last long, though, because his father didn't really approve of the relationship. It's not known if that was because they were gay or he just didn't like them together. But Jean and Thierry began to fight because of this, and Jean actually went home, but Thierry stayed there and started his own business. This was called Transformé Star, and this was actually a talent agency for trans artists. However, this all had to be shut down nearly a year later because he wasn't making any money. This is when Thierry decided to head back to Paris, and the murders began again. However, this time he was doing it alone. So what happened when there was a next gap in the murders and no more victims were piling up? Well, this was said that Thierry got a job during this time as a talent scout for a local media agency, so he was making money that way for a while. However, when the company went bankrupt, the kills happened again. However, only one woman was murdered at this time, and then they stopped again. And this is because Thierry had actually attacked his drug dealer with a baseball bat. And it was so bad that this drug dealer called the police on him and pressed charges. Thierry was sentenced to 16 months in prison. So while the police were searching for a killer, he was right under their noses. And like I said, the fingerprints didn't trace to him because they weren't in a database. And this was actually after they had asked the prisons to test the fingerprints. So nobody even knew he was in custody. As soon as he was released after those 16 months, Thierry began to throw extravagant parties for a reason that we will find out soon enough. He was murdering at a more rapid pace. He then murdered 2 more women and failed to murder another, and this was ultimately be his biggest mistake, because this woman would be able to identify him. He was now going to be tried for the murder of 18 elderly women. However, he didn't seem to care very much. He wanted to buy all of the papers with the articles about him, and he seemed like he loved the spotlight. His accomplice, Jean-Thierry Maturin, was also arrested for murder at this time, but Thierry would not be making it to trial. You see, while in jail the last time for attacking his drug dealer, where he was there for 16 months, he had found out that he had HIV. This is what was said to have caused him to throw these extravagant parties and to begin to murder even more rapidly, because he knew he was dying. On April 16th, 1989, Thierry would die from the effects of AIDS at 26 years old. It was said he was in a state of near paralysis with both tuberculosis and meningitis, but unfortunately he had yet to be tried for the murders. However, his accomplice Jean would be. For the first 9 murders, Jean received a life sentence and 18 years without parole. But it was believed that Thierry was the real mastermind of all of this, and the criminal justice system just took what was left to get justice for the victims, and this was Jean. It was said that in this couple there was a weak one, and this was Jean, who looked to Thierry for guidance, money, drugs, stability, and Thierry was the strong one who could make him do whatever he wanted. One of the officers working this case said Paulin was not a serial killer, he was a spree killer. A spree killer is a pathological killer who kills to experience a physical or moral pleasure. He enjoys the terror he inspires in others. But a spree killer is different. Paulin was a born criminal. It was said that this was the first time in France that they had a great series of crimes like the United States. The lawyers even said it was extremely hard to look at these crime scene photos and that Thierry was one of the worst killers that they had ever seen. The defense lawyer said the photos and pictures were awful. It was difficult, very difficult. I must admit that when I studied the case files that I didn't have lunch. I couldn't have dinner. I couldn't. And this is from someone who looked at many different crime scenes. So do you think that Jean was more of a part of this than he was given credit for, or do you think that it was his need for drugs and his killer boyfriend's ideas that persuaded him to do so? Also, do you believe that these long periods where no murders were happening when Jean and Thierry went back to their father's home, do you think they stopped killing, or do you think they continued to kill there? Of course, we know when Thierry was in prison, he couldn't have been killing, but do you think they killed elsewhere? And do you think that Jean ever killed on his own? These are some very interesting questions that I'm not sure we will ever get the answer to. I really do think that Thierry was the mastermind here. He was the one who was okay with killing and who decided that's how he was going to get his money. And I think that Jean was more apt to do it because he wanted drugs and he knew they needed money rather than he wanted to kill. And it's unfortunate that everything was basically pinned on him because Thierry was already dead. I love doing different cases from different countries, even if I do kind of butcher the names, because it's so interesting how things are done in different countries, and we don't really hear about cases from, France here in the United States. At least I don't. And when I research, I feel like not a lot of them are done because it is hard to find resources on them. And I do want to thank my resources, so they will be linked down below like always. But yeah, I just think it's a very interesting case and I had never heard of it before. So I also want to ask, do you think that his bullying, the fact that he was always kind of an outcast for his skin color, for the fact that he was gay, his sexuality, do you think that played a role in why he became a killer? Of course, we know that doesn't make a killer, and there are many people who overcome their bullying and overcome the horrible things that are done to them and don't kill. But do you think that played a part in his killing? And also the fact that he kind of bounced from home to home and didn't ever have an attachment to anybody. I think that that can be a huge part in making a killer. I think attachment is something we really need to look into as far as that playing a huge role in the psyche of serial killers. But if you haven't heard about reactive attachment disorder, I will link a case down below that I go into detail about it. It's the case of David Michael Kruger. And I also, always recommend you to do research on your own if you would like to. But that case, I did go in depth about it. There's also articles in the description of that video. that you should really look into. But I hope you enjoyed this. If you want me to do more cases from different countries and you have a specific case you want me to do, leave it down below. Make sure to thumbs up, and I also want to just tell you I have an Instagram where I've been posting a lot of, you know, my outfits and stuff like that. It's just fun, and if you want to follow me there, I always post updates of when I post a video. If you don't, you know, want to miss out on a notification or whatever, you can follow me there at @BrookeMcKenna_, and I also have an ASMR channel, which is Genuine Gym ASMR. If you were unaware, I do ASMR. I'm actually about to film one, so yeah, check it out. Okay, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.